Okay, this is going to be a little bit longer as well. We got quite a few slides to get through. Earth's early history. Just going to remind you again that this is completely hypothetical, speculative. Nobody was there, but we're going off of the evidence. So, speaking of that evidence, it suggests that Earth formed as pieces of cosmic debris collided with one another. And while the planet was very young, we think that the Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. When it was young, scientists think it was struck by one or more huge objects, and it melted. Then for millions of years, there were volcanoes, there were comets, there were asteroids. Earth was taking a beating. And then about 4.2 billion years ago, scientists think Earth cooled, allowed solid rocks to form, water to condense and fall as rain, and oceans started forming. Did not look like Earth today. Earth's early atmosphere contained little or no oxygen. Main components of the atmosphere were carbon dioxide, water vapor, and nitrogen, plus a little sprinkling of other yucky, poisonous stuff that aerobic organisms can't take in large amounts: carbon monoxide, hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide. Because of the gases that were in the atmosphere, scientists think the sky was probably pinkish orange. And because the oceans contained lots of dissolved iron, scientists think they were rusty looking, probably brown. This is probably one of the most important experiments about early Earth. This is the Miller and Urey experiment. They tried to recreate Earth's early conditions and tried to see what could happen, what could form. So they had a sterile flask with water and boiled it because the Earth was really hot. They added the gases that they thought were present in Earth's early atmosphere, methane, ammonia, and hydrogen, and then they added an electric charge to simulate lightning. Now, the deal is they passed the gases through a condensation chamber. Cold water cooled them, causing drops to form, and what they looked at, what they found in that liquid, 21 amino acids, or building blocks of proteins. The suggestion here is that organic compounds that were necessary for life could have arisen from simpler compounds on a primitive Earth. The problem is that the composition of the Earth's early atmosphere that Miller and Urey used, it was incorrect. So new experiments have been conducted using what we now think the composition of Earth's early atmosphere was, and it's produced similar results. But I find it just interesting to point out here that all the evolutionary biologists have said, even way back before, is that living things can only come from other living things. But what this is trying to show is that the components of living things, the building blocks of living things, can come from non-living things. It's kind of interesting little point. 200 to 300 million years after the Earth cooled enough to carry liquid water, there were cells that were prokaryotic, basically. Scientists trying to figure out how those could have originated. They look at what they can do in the lab today. So they have large organic molecules that form tiny bubbles called protenoid microspheres under certain conditions. Microspheres aren't cells, but they have some characteristics that are similar to cells. They have selectively permeable membranes through which water molecules can pass. They have simple means of storing and releasing energy, just like cells. So several hypotheses, and just let me emphasize to you again, we're talking about evolutionary biology, and several different hypotheses that go along with evolutionary biology. So not even the evolutionary biologists can agree. Everybody's got a different school of thought. But these several hypotheses suggest that structures similar to protenoid microspheres acquired the characteristics of living cells as early as 3.8 billion years ago. Now, the other thing that needs to be explained is, how did DNA and RNA develop? We know this central dogma. We have DNA that stores the information, it's transcribed into RNA and then translated into proteins. There's an RNA first hypothesis, or RNA world hypothesis, that suggests that RNA evolved before DNA. If RNA developed first, there are several steps that could have led to DNA-directed protein synthesis. Scientists have conducted experiments, like Miller and Urey, simulating conditions on early Earth. These experiments suggest that small sequences of RNA could have formed from simpler molecules. And this is, again, under the right conditions. Some RNA sequences help DNA with replication. Other RNA sequences process messenger RNA after transcription. Other RNA sequences catalyze chemical reactions. Some RNA molecules even grow and replicate on their own. So the thinking here is that RNA is very versatile and it does a lot of things. And so because of that, the RNA world, or RNA first hypothesis, might make sense. So one hypothesis about the origin of life suggests that RNA evolved before DNA. And that's what you see here. We have inorganic matter here, and then simple organic molecules have developed. They arrange themselves into RNA nucleotides. And then we know that through what we know about RNA here in the present day, RNA is able to replicate itself, synthesize proteins, function in information storage. And then we know that there are some viruses, the retroviruses, like our friend the filovirus of Ebola from the hot zone. RNA can be used as genetic material, and reverse transcription can turn that into DNA. RNA and RNA, going from mRNA to tRNA, and we have rRNA as well, helping in protein synthesis. And then RNA is used to build proteins. This is the RNA first hypothesis. Scientists also look at microfossils of prokaryotes. The earliest evidence that's been found is that prokaryotes came around about 3.5 billion years ago. And remember that we didn't have oxygen back then. Earth's atmosphere contained very little oxygen, so these were anaerobic bacteria. Some of these prokaryotes mutated and had a good mutation, a beneficial mutation, that allowed them to produce their own food. Scientists think photosynthetic bacteria became common, and by about 2.2 billion years ago, these guys were producing oxygen. At first, the oxygen reacted with iron in the oceans, producing rust. Basically, iron oxide is rust. Iron oxide sank to the ocean floor because it's not soluble in water, and formed big banding patterns, bands of iron, that are the sources of most of the iron ore that's mined today. So once that iron was removed from the oceans, they changed color from brown to blue-green. Then that oxygen gas, once the iron was all in the oceans was all combined with the oxygen, now we have free oxygen. It's not being combined with the iron anymore. Oxygen gas began to accumulate in the atmosphere. We get the ozone layer forming, and the skies turn blue instead of that pinkish orange that it was before. And over several 100 million years, oxygen levels rose, scientists think, until they reached today's levels. Many scientists think that Earth's early atmosphere might be similar to the gases released by a volcano today. Because scientists think that there were so many volcanic eruptions back when Earth was young, they make the conclusion that what's coming out of a volcano might be similar to what the majority of the atmosphere was back then. So what we have on the left-hand side here is Earth's atmosphere today. Mostly nitrogen and oxygen, and other gases are about 1%. It's a little different setup from volcanoes. Water vapor's 3/4, nitrogen's only 5%, carbon dioxide, and then other gases, about 1/10, what you see there. The first cells evolved in the absence of oxygen, and actually oxygen was poisonous. So once oxygen started becoming common in the atmosphere, it actually drove those early organisms to extinction. Some organisms, again, best suited, best adapted to their environment, evolved new metabolic pathways. Now they didn't necessarily evolve them, but there were some mutant organisms, mutant cells of the species that had that metabolic pathway. Those were the ones that used oxygen for respiration. They were the ones that survived in an oxygen-containing atmosphere. They were the ones that passed on their genes to the next generation. The other way that the species evolved over time is they had ways to protect themselves from oxygen's powerful reactive abilities. Now, how did eukaryotic cells arise? Eukaryotic cells, remember, they have a nucleus, and prokaryotes have no nucleus. Eukaryotes also have complex organelles. They have mitochondria, and almost all eukaryotes have mitochondria, and then plants and algae also have chloroplasts. Here's how scientists think eukaryotic cells arose. Time frame, about 2 billion years ago. Scientists think that ancient prokaryotes began evolving internal cell membranes, and so you have a double cell membrane, a double membrane. These prokaryotes were the ancestors of today's eukaryotes. The endosymbiotic theory states that prokaryotic cells entered these ancestral eukaryotes. The small prokaryotes began living inside the larger cells. Let's take a closer look at this. We see a symbiotic relationship, so two organisms working very closely in conjunction with one another. A symbiotic relationship evolved between primitive eukaryotic cells and the prokaryotic cells inside them. So what we see here, we have an ancient anaerobic prokaryote right here, and it's got a nucleus. Nuclear envelope is forming. Some aerobic bacteria that are smaller seek shelter. Either that or they're swallowed up by that larger cell. And over time, now we have a symbiotic relationship. The little ancient aerobic bacteria get protection inside the larger cell. And the ancient aerobic bacteria provide energy in the form of ATP to the larger cell. That's the mitochondrion. So this would be an animal cell. One with a mitochondrion. Now, go one step farther. Ancient photosynthetic bacteria. Now, if they get swallowed up or they seek shelter within a primitive prokaryote, an ancient prokaryote, now we have a photosynthetic eukaryote. And what we see here, again, the little cells get shelter, and the big cell gets its own food. Now it can produce its own food in the form of glucose. And then these other little guys break down the glucose and produce energy in the form of ATP. So these are the plants, the plant cells, as indicated right here. This is how scientists think that plants and photosynthetic unicellular eukaryotes arose. And then these guys down here that I talked about before, animals, fungi, non-photosynthetic unicellular eukaryotes. The endosymbiotic theory, interestingly enough, was proposed more than a century ago. What people saw at the time when they were looking at under the microscope is that the membranes of mitochondria and chloroplasts resembled the cell membranes of free-living prokaryotes, that double cell membrane. So we have two related hypotheses here. The other similarities, just in case it doesn't come up later. Other similarities, mitochondria and chloroplasts have their own DNA. We already talked about that with mitochondria. Chloroplasts have their own DNA as well. And then mitochondria and chloroplasts also have their own ribosomes. So they can produce their own proteins without the help of whatever's going on outside of them. So they could technically exist on their own. So again, mitochondria evolved, scientists think, from endosymbiotic prokaryotes that were able to use oxygen to generate ATP. Without this ability, cells would have been killed by the free oxygen in the atmosphere. And I sort of already went over this, so you can see that again. The other part, chloroplasts, scientists think, evolved from endosymbiotic prokaryotes that had the ability to photosynthesize. So these evolved into the chloroplasts of plants and algae. And here you see that again. Like I said before, in the 1960s, the discovery was made that mitochondria and chloroplasts contain DNA, circular strand of DNA, similar to bacterial DNA. Lynn Margulis was the person who discovered these things. She also noticed that mitochondria and chloroplasts have ribosomes, whose size and structure closely resemble those of bacteria. Finally, I didn't mention this already, mitochondria and chloroplasts, like bacteria, reproduce by binary fission when cells containing them divide by mitosis. So they duplicate their DNA, they enlarge, and they divide in half. So these similarities provide evidence of common ancestry between free-living bacteria and the organelles of living eukaryotic cells. This is the endosymbiont hypothesis. When prokaryotes reproduce asexually, like I just said, the binary fission, they duplicate their genetic material and pass it on to daughter cells. It's basically mitosis. It's efficient, but it doesn't produce a whole lot of variety. We've talked about this before. Genetic variation is only due to mutation. Sexually reproducing eukaryotes get genetic material from two parents. Meiosis, fertilization, shuffle and reshuffle genes we talked about with meiosis crossing over the independent assortment. So the offspring of sexually reproducing offspring are never identical to either of their parents or their siblings, except for identical twins. And that variation we've talked about before as well increases the likelihood of some organisms of the population being adaptable or able to exist in a new or changing environmental condition. So that's an advantage, sexual reproduction. Multicellularity evolved a few 100 million years, scientists think, after the evolution of sexual reproduction. Early multicellular organisms likely underwent a series of adaptive radiations, resulting in great diversity.